Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who are tuning in. Today is August 21st, 2021. A wonderful day to give thanks and praise to the Lord. Today we will be reading only from Genesis chapter 12. So for those who are reading along with us, we are here to read with you and also comment, but not like the weekend, during the week. Here we go. The call of Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." This was a command, by the way. It required action. And it was a test. For Abraham did not know the land that he was going to. And notice, God didn't say, "I'll give it to you." God said, "I will show it to you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So this was the promise that God had made to the Jewish people through Abraham, and still holds true today. And this is speaking really of the seed of Jesus to come. And so Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. That's his nephew. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed Haran. Now notice that it took Abraham a while to obey. He didn't do it instantly. And he didn't leave his father until he was passed away. And he took Lot with him. Now God said to promise was only to Abraham. So taking Lot couldn't have meant anything good here. So Abraham took his wife, Sarah, and his brother's son, Lot, and they took the U-Haul and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. So finally, he's becoming more obedient. And remember, this promise to be great was said 3 times, and it was with a purpose here. However, when you think about Canaan, remember Ham, remember Shem, the children of Noah, that Canaan and Ham were cursed. So think about that before they go into the land here. So when they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak at Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So there, Abraham built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. It's always right to give the Lord thanks and praise and honor. And again, this is to his offspring. And remember what the Jews in the wilderness, after they left Egypt, came back and said, "There's giants in the land. We're not going in there. Sure, the land's filled with milk and honey, but we're not taking that." Well, Abraham was in that land before they were. For there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, which also Abraham never owned a house. He was just a pilgriming sojourner in a tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and there he invoked the name of the Lord. So it was there. Remember in Genesis 4:26, I believe, at the right after the flood, that the men began invoking the name of the Lord. They've been calling on the name of the Lord. So Abraham had learned that practice. He had learned to call on the name of the Lord, which is interesting because he did not come from a family that was, they were more of a family of idol worshippers. Verse 9, and Abraham journeyed along the stages of a process toward the Negeb. Verse 10, now there was a famine in the land. So Abraham went down, think about that, he went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. Isn't this an ironic twist in history, too? Canaan and the Jews in the wilderness, then the Jewish people slaves to the Egyptians. That was, again, the land of milk and honey. But think about this, a famine. Joseph was sent to save Egypt and Israel. And the biggest note behind this was that Abraham didn't trust God, even through the famine, to provide for his needs. He took it on himself to go to Egypt. God didn't tell him to go there. So perhaps that's where the 430 years of slavery comes in. Disobedience from one cost many. Verse 11. When he was to enter Egypt, he said to his wife, I know that you are a beautiful woman in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will rise up and kill me. But they will let you live. So say to them that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life might be spared on your account. Did you ever wonder about the treachery in Abraham's family line that was passed on from Uncle Laban to Jacob? And how Jacob was also a trickster and a supplanter with Esau? Ever see that? Verse 14. So when Abraham entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. There's a legend about this we might read about later. And when the officials of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to the Pharaoh. And the woman was taken, stolen, taken into the Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he did deal well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female slaves, female donkeys, and camels. So gifts. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Think about this. The promised seed, the lineage of Jesus. Had he defiled Sarah, wouldn't have been a good thing. Satan was always at work in the background. By the way, this affliction of the great plagues, doesn't that sound like Moses? Let my people go. That happened later. History does repeat itself when we don't learn or read God's word. What is this you have done to me? Why have you not told me that you were his wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. And Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning him, and they set him on his way. Kind of like the sheriff escorting you to the city line. Get out of here. With his wife and all that he had. So they suffered due to the lie, as we also do. When we lie and we don't trust God for our protection and our provision, we suffer very much for it. It's not needed, but we do. Why? Because we think we have a better plan, kind of like Ford. Ford has a better idea. So let's review. God's call of Abraham to Egypt. It's a sevenfold promise. I will, I will, I will, I will, I will. Come out from them, leave them. I will give you the blessing if you trust me, and others will be blessed in you sevenfold. God's previous covenant with Abraham, he did tell him this before, but he had to remind him, because in Acts 7:2-4, it was revealed through Stephen that this promise was made to Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran. Genesis 12, 1-3 here, repeats that promise that God had said to Abraham. So God repeated the promise. Now that his father was dead, Abraham was compelled to a more complete obedience. God could have left him right there, just as Jesus used to tell the other fishermen, let the dead bury the dead. God could have moved on. He didn't. He chose Abraham, and he stuck with him. Abraham's partial obedience did not take God's promise away, but instead it meant the fulfillment of Abraham's promise that was delayed until Abraham was finally ready to do what the Lord had told him to do. Abraham certainly would become a giant of faith, even being the father of those who believe, as Galatians 3:7 tells us. But he did not start as a hero of faith. We see Abraham as an example of growing in faith and obedience, because sanctification is a process. It's not a given. It's not positional like salvation. When the Greeks overran Palestine, thinking about those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse, I will curse you. Well, they desecrated the altar in the Jewish temple, and they were soon conquered by Rome. And when Rome killed Paul and many others and destroyed Jerusalem under Titus, well, Rome, the great Roman Empire, soon fell. Spain was reduced to a fifth-rate nation after the Inquisition against the Jews. Poland fell after the pogroms. Hitler's Germany went down after its orgies of anti-Semitism. Britain lost her empire when she broke her faith with Israel, as is recounted by the great late Donald Gray Barnhouse. Now, this is one reason why the United States has been so blessed, because the USA was one of the first modern nations to grant full citizenship and protection of the Jewish people. Not only was Abraham promised him a blessing, even to the point where all the families of the earth would be blessed in Abraham. That amazing promise was fulfilled in the Messiah that came from Abraham's lineage. But Lot did go with him, and this was more partial obedience and disobedience by Abraham. So God commanded him to go out from your family, remember? Yet he brought his nephew Lot. Maybe that was correct, saying not. Yeah, Lot would not be a blessing to Abraham. He would be nothing but trouble and an inconvenience. Abraham was 75 when he departed from Haran. Think about that. That's pretty old. I wouldn't want to be picking up and getting in the U-Haul and moving around at 75. I'd want to be pretty retired. Abraham came into the land of Canaan at this advanced age. Fathering a child through Sarah seemed a long-forgotten help. But he did arrive in Canaan, as we see in verse 5-6, and he did leave the land of Ur of the Chaldeans, and he did stop in Haran long enough to acquire many possessions of Canaan, and Abraham came in as a stranger to live in a populated land by tribes that were set by violence and sin. Genesis 34, 1-5 tells us, and it would become even worse, as Genesis 15:16 tells us. Abraham passed through the land to the place of Shechem. This was Abraham's first stopping point in Canaan. Here he came to a notable oak tree, the terebinth tree of Moreh. The name Shechem means shoulder. It probably gets its meaning from the geography of the area. The idea may be between two hills of Gerizim and Ebal, like shoulders, with Shechem in the middle of them. Shechem was not only in the midst of two mountains, but it was right in the middle of Canaan. And when you think about it, Canaan has many milestone markers. For instance, this is where Jacob came safely when he returned with his wives and children from his sojourn with Laban, Uncle Laban. And this is where Jacob bought a piece of land from a Canaanite named Hamor for 100 pieces of silver. This is also where Jacob had built an altar to the Lord, and he called it El Elohi Israel. And this is the established connection we now know as Jacob's well. Shechem was the place where Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, was raped, and the sons of Jacob massacred the men of the city in retaliation. Remember, they told them, "Okay, we'll make peace with you while if you all get circumcised." And while they were in pain, they easily overtook them, betraying that agreement. Treachery always did run in Jacob and Abraham's family. This was the plot of ground that Jacob had gave his son Joseph, the land that Jacob had conquered from the Amorites with his sword and bow in the unrecorded battle of Genesis 48:22. This is where the bones of Joseph eventually were buried and carried from Egypt, Joshua 24:32. And this is where Joshua made a covenant with Israel, renewing their commitment to the God of Israel and proclaiming, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Remember in Joshua 24. Shechem's New Testament is Sychar, where Jesus met the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. The Canaanites were then in the land. Abraham came to the land that God had promised, and yet the Canaanites were still in the land. They had no intention of giving that land to Abraham and would not give it up until they were forced out some 400 years later, after Joshua took them and Moses couldn't while they were in the wilderness 40 years. So God appears to Abraham finally in Canaan. Abraham never owned any of this land except for the burial lot he bought, Genesis 23:14. And yet, God's promise was enough to assure Abraham that he indeed owned the whole country. So there he built that altar, and the altar was important to Abraham because it was a place to meet with God, to offer sacrifice for sin, to show submission to God, and to worship God. Christians, too, today have an altar, Hebrews 13, when we meet with God at our own place, where we remember the sacrifice that Jesus made, Ephesians 5, and where we submit to God as living sacrifices in Romans 12, and where we offer sacrifice of praise in Hebrews 13:15. So when he pitched his tent, even in the land God gave him, Abraham again never owned a house. He lived in a tent. Tents are homes for those who are just passing through but do not put down permanent roots. Pilgrim's Progress is a good story about that. There was a famine in the land, and again, the famine was serious. Many people died from hunger. It was right for Abraham to be concerned about the famine and feeding his family, but it was wrong in Abraham to thinking God would not provide for his needs in the place God called him to live. After all, God called Abraham to live in Canaan, not in Egypt. Abraham, like most of us, found it easier to trust God in a far-off promise than it is instead of the right now needs. So Abraham did go down, and when we do disobey God, we do go down, and he was tested. In this way, we often believe our actions are right because no harm can come from them. Though God blessed and protected Abraham, even in Egypt, he came away with excess baggage and a rebuke from a pagan king. Harm came from his trip in Egypt, as we would see later on, too, in the children of Israel. The harm especially shows up in a slave girl named Hagar, whom Sarah received while in Egypt, and she became a great source of trouble for Abraham's family. Thus, the beginning of the Arab Islam nation. Because Abraham and Sarah wanted to do it their way and not God's way and not believe in the promise, so they did it in their own strength by having Ishmael. Verse 11 through 13. Sensing potential and danger in Egypt, Abraham persuades Sarah to lie on his behalf. Now here's the Jewish legend we talked about. So when Abraham went into Egypt, he tried to hide Sarah in a box. And the Egyptian customs officials asked, "What's in the box?" And he said, "Barley." "No," they said. "It contains wheat." "Very well," answered Abraham. "I'll pay the custom tax on the wheat." Then the officer says, "It also contains pepper." And then Abraham says, "Okay, I'll pay the taxes on the pepper." And then the officer said it contained gold. And Abraham says, "Okay, I'll pay the charges on the gold." And the officer said, "Then it had precious stones." And Abraham said, "Okay, I will pay even the taxes on the precious stone." By this time, the officers were curious. They insisted on opening the box because Abraham was willing to pay and pay and pay for the taxes, which is a good example to us. We will pay and pay and pay and pay for the lies that we commit and things we try to hide. It only snowballs and gets worse. So when they did, all of Egypt shined with the beauty of Sarah. And these same legends say that in comparison to Sarah, all other women looked like monkeys. So she was even more beautiful than Eve. And this is cited in Ginsburg. So he said, "Please say you're my sister." This was in fact a half-truth. The devil always puts in our mind the idea to say a partial truth and think we can wash our hands and justify ourselves. Sarah was Abraham's half-sister in Genesis 20:12. Yet this half-truth really was a whole lie. Abraham's intent here was to clearly deceive, and he trusted in his deception to protect him instead of trusting the Lord. So if we want to do something wrong, we can find some good reasons to do it, can't we? If we can't think of the reasons of ourselves, the devil is happy to suggest them to us. So the woman was taken into the Pharaoh's house. Understanding the place Abraham and Sarah were to have in God's redemptive plan, we realize how serious this was and could have been. God did not want Sarah's womb to be defiled by a Gentile king, because the Messiah would come from her line of descendants. Verses 16 through 20 tell us Abraham finally leaves Egypt. He shouldn't have been there in the first place, after being rebuked by the Pharaoh. Isn't that interesting? The Pharaoh rebukes the Israelite, and later Moses, the Israelite, rebukes the Pharaoh. So he treated Abraham well for her sake. God blessed Abraham even when he didn't do as he should. God continued to protect Abraham even when Abraham acted like a liar, which he was. Abraham did not call back his promise to God did not call back his promise to Abraham because the promise depended on God and not Abraham. So God kept his word, even though Abraham didn't keep his. "What is this you've done to me?" said the king. Sadly, a pagan king had to rebuke Abram. God's divine protection of Abram and Sarai shows that it would not have trusted in God, that if he would have trusted in God and told the truth, everything would have been all right. But God is in the business of growing Abraham into a great man of faith, and this requires circumstances where Abraham must trust God. Faith is not a mushroom that grows overnight in a damp soil. It is an oak tree that grows for 1,000 years under the blast of the wind and the rain, said the great late Donald Gray Barnhouse. Well, that was quite a word. Genesis 12. I hope that blessed you today. Let's go to Lord in prayer. Father God, thank you for sharing your word with us as an example to us today. I pray, Lord, that I was moved out of the way, Lord, and that you have spoken to your people and deeply affected their hearts in this reading. And we ask your blessing, Lord, upon it and the people who tuned in now, pre-rapture, and perhaps later, post-rapture and the Great Tribulation, or any time that they're able to. We ask, Lord, your blessing upon them, strengthen their faith, give them peace in their heart and in their home. In Jesus' holy name, amen. Well, folks, we will be reading again tomorrow, So please join us. There will be no question of the day or song of the day, as there usually isn't on the weekend. But we'll be looking forward to seeing you, should the Lord tarry. Till next time, God bless you.